Good morning, everybody. Warm welcome to both our participants in person and online. We're being joined by quite a few colleagues and friends online as well, so a warm welcome. This is our first policy dialogue on the work in progress on the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis on children and vulnerable households in Egypt. And this is really focused today for academics. I'm Shireen Ghonaim. I'm the Director of Communications and Policy Outreach. I'll be playing the host and master of ceremony for today, having the pleasure to introduce my colleagues and friends and speakers and panelists during the course of the day. Without further ado, I'd like to ask my colleague and friend, Ms. Yasmin Fahim, Director of Research Programs, who would be extending the welcome on behalf of Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi, our Managing Director. Yasmin.
Good morning, everyone. Very happy to welcome you to our first day of the Policy Roundtable on the impact of the Ukraine and Russian crisis on households and children in Egypt. And this comes in a context of our collaboration with UNICEF. So this event is jointly organized by ERF and UNICEF. And this topic falls in line within the ERF research agenda and our priorities for 2022 and 2023. And to be able to address this issue, we've prepared a policy document or a policy brief, which would serve as like a background paper for our discussion today. And we look forward to your input and your contribution to help us sharpen the analysis and revise the final output. So we count on you to help guide these revisions. So please be generous with your comments. And the structure of the 2 days is such that the first day will address the issues from an analytical research standpoint and how to best capture the impact and what are the channels of transmission and so on. While for tomorrow, we'll be focusing on the policy interventions and what can we do to mitigate the repercussions of the crisis in terms of policy actions. Now, before I conclude, I'd like to thank our UNICEF colleagues for partnering with ERF on this very interesting and timely topic. And we look forward to more future collaborations as we continue working on also our next phase, and Peter will be giving you more information on that, which will address issues related to social protection for non-nationals in Egypt. And finally, I thank you all for coming to join us today, whether you are in the room with us or if you are joining us through Zoom. And we look forward to engaging in fruitful discussions. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Yasmin. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing our new friends at UNICEF. I'm really glad that the way this is designed, that we'd have a chance to hear from Jeremy and then from Peter. And also we'll have a chance to hear them and see them moderate the following sessions, so that it's very much a collaborative approach. I'd like to start by introducing Jeremy. Jeremy Hopkins, he's the UNICEF representative in Egypt, and I love the way he's actually introduced himself in the bio with being a citizen of the world, actually. So he's half Kenyan and half British, and with fantastic expertise in the field of children. I couldn't have found anybody with such a fantastic track record. It started since he's been working in Somalia, managing programs on child protection, youth engagement, children affected by HIV, and related behavior change communications. He continued to work on child protection in Mozambique on specific focus on HIV. He's been then working as deputy representative for UNICEF in the Central African Republic, Yemen, and Somalia. Couldn't have been better choice. And more recently, he's been acting as the representative of the UNICEF in South Sudan and has just completed his tour of duty as UNICEF representative in Bronzy, August 2020. The floor is yours, Jeremy.
Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here, Shireen, Yasmin. Thank you for the introductions and distinguished and very distinguished, in fact, academics around the table. It's an honor to be here. So thank you very much for coming and for indeed for setting up this partnership with us. It's, with ERF, we're really pleased that we're able to take a proper, good, hard look at what is happening globally and locally vis-a-vis the evolving economic situation, which is indeed of great concern. Egypt got through the COVID crisis, if you like, the economic sort of face of the crisis pretty well, although of course with some impact. And now once again, we are witnessing another global crisis, which is manifesting itself in this rapid increase in oil prices, fertilizer costs, unprecedented inflation, and most importantly for us, of course, and children, is a rising cost of food and other essential commodities. WFP has estimated that the number of people who will suffer from acute hunger, in addition to those already due to this crisis, is an additional 47 million people, including 6 million in the Middle East. And of course, this is having a disastrous impact on children, who are the most vulnerable in a food crisis. The most recent family health survey data came out in, the data was collected last year, if I'm not mistaken. And we did see great improvements in, for example, stunting and wasting, which reduced from 21% to 12 or 13%. Stunting, just for those who don't know, means that your body is too small and so is your brain, and the damage is done by the time you're 2 years old, and it is irreversible. So that's a tragedy that happens every year in this country and in every country around the world. 12% is not bad, but 12% of 40 million children is quite a lot of million children. Now, in a food security crisis, one of the first indicators to go is nutrition. So we can expect already that those nutrition indicators are going to start deteriorating again, which is a tragedy, and we have to do everything we can to stop it. The World Bank estimates that for every 1 point increase in food prices, 10 million people fall into extreme poverty. And so if food prices simply remain flat, just due to population growth, we have an additional 100 million poor people in the world. And in the Middle East, that translates into threatening the lives and livelihoods of 2.8 million people. So these are big figures. The increase in food prices always impacts poor people more than less poor people. On the one hand, countries such as Egypt are more dependent on imported foods and goods, and on the other hand, poor households spend a higher proportion of their income on food. I believe it's 40% of household income of the poorest people is spent on food. If food prices increase, you can start doing the maths. A simulation by IFPRI to measure the impact of the increases in food, fuel, and fertilizer prices on household consumption found that Egypt's national headcount poverty rates are expected to increase by 1.8%. You'll recall, not very long ago, we were able to report, we meaning Egypt, was able to report a decrease in poverty of about 1.8%. So we're seeing, the potential reversal of that, and the study also confirms that the wheat calorie intake per day declines with wealth, which is not a surprise, thus leaving children, as usual, in such households at very high risk. Monetary, fiscal, and social policy must carefully consider these negative consequences, and that's what we're here to do. These risk, or almost certainly will, roll back some of the recent advances we have made in human development and on the SDGs. And that's why it's crucial to be having this conversation. And I'd like us to think together about how we can use the very limited, but it does exist, the very limited fiscal space to be more efficient with our spending on critical services to which children must continue to have access. Those services, of course, being health, nutrition, education, social protection, and indeed other forms of protection. There's innovative financing mechanisms we can look at, and we need to make sure that we build into the discussions how we can use the existing systems, which are pretty impressive in Egypt, but to make them more shock responsive. That's the critical piece. The systems are not as agile as they could be. And if we can improve the agility and the efficiency, we can actually probably maximize increase the potential of the existing systems. I'm talking, needless to say, about Takaful and Karama and others. This 2-day policy dialogue, we're going to be discussing evidence on the impact of the Ukraine crisis. We shouldn't be doing anything without evidence. We cannot use layman's logic and intuition, because although we might be right with that layman's logic and intuition, it doesn't stand up when you start doing proper programming. So I'm really, really pleased that we have this forum to give us a proper academic insight into the outlook, which doesn't look good. But we need to deal with it. And obviously, Egypt is not alone. This is every country in the world, but Egypt is particularly vulnerable, as we just mentioned. I'd like to recognize Scott here from the Resident Coordinator's Office, who is also a great resource from the UN side. The funding that has gone into this partnership comes from the SDG Fund, which is a sort of UN-wide fund, and we're doing this piece, not this piece, but we're doing this as part of a bigger, broader framework with IOM and WFP, both of whom, of course, have clear interests in this work and the related work. I'm really pleased that we're doing this. We'll be able to take this back to the UN as well. It's not just about UNICEF. The outcomes of this are about children and poor families, and that is relevant to a great many actors in the development world. So I think you should also be very proud I am very proud anyway, to be part of this conversation, because it will have a direct impact on the work that we're all doing. And with that, I will be in fact, only listening, because I have a lot to learn, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to give the floor to our friend and colleague, Luigi Peter Reino. Peter is a socioeconomist currently working as Chief of Social Policy at UNICEF Egypt. He is a social protection and social policy expert and has worked and lived in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He's previously led the Social Protection Technical Assistance Unit under the Social Policy section in UNICEF Ghana, and advised several international organizations, including GIZ, UNDP, IOM, on poverty reduction and social protection. It's very high on the ERF agenda as well. So really pleased to have you with us. And the floor is yours, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Jasmine and Jeremy as well. Thanks for joining us today here, as you can see, a very selected invitees. I also want to thank my team, Francisca, Manar and Omar, and Lina. She's not here today. She is out of Cairo, but she will be with us tomorrow. So just a few minutes to tell you about this partnership that we just signed after several months of discussions with ERF. We are pleased to start this partnership. I mean, this is the first step, and we already been discussing on the next phases of this partnership. The current partnership has basically two streams of work. The first stream starts today, which is focusing on the impact of Ukraine crisis on families and children. And it's basically split into two seminars, one today and one tomorrow. Today, it's about hearing from you. We've invited a diverse team of academia, some NGOs as well. And tomorrow, the seminar will be focusing we've invited only government and the development partners. So the idea is that some of the discussion happening today can be brought forward to tomorrow's meeting and provide some ideas to those that actually take the decisions. All of this will be merged into a policy document. We already have a draft that will be presented by our colleague, Dr. May Gadalla. And will be improved, and we will add whatever comes out from these two seminars and then deliver it more officially to the government as to take it forward. Now, this is the first stream. The second stream, which is going to start next year, is, as Jasmine was mentioning, it's about inclusive social protection. So when we often talk about children in Egypt, we don't talk about Egyptian children. We talk about children in Egypt, because they are not only Egyptian children with the Egyptian nationality. There are lots of migrants, there are lots of refugees, and as UNICEF, and we believe also as a country, we need to do as much as we can to make sure they can also benefit from several programs that the government is implementing. So the second stream will focus on providing, again, a space for discussion and dialogue, and provide some concrete ideas to the government to make sure that all children in Egypt can benefit from social protection interventions. There's going to be a call for paper and for research ideas. There are going to be several seminars and also a conference and a policy document which is meant to inform the government on the next steps. I think I've used all my time, so over to you, Shirin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yasmin, Jeremy, and Peter for the introductory remarks. I'd like to recognize a really distinguished members of the academia and the policy making around the table, and also online before we start. So it's very promising for a very lively discussion. I'd also like to bring your attention that this event is being recorded and broadcasted live. So we'd always be able to get back to it if we need to. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Dr. May Gadalla and Nisma. Dr. May Gadalla is Associate Professor, Department of Statistics, Cairo University, and our lead data and statistics manager at ERF. So we'll be hearing from her first, and then we'll, Nisma Aimer, our senior statistician at ERF, would also be sharing the presentation for your comments. For our online participants, please raise hand or include the questions in the Q&A session, in the Q&A section, so that we can address them as we proceed. Dr. May, the floor is yours.
the presentation website. Yeah, sure.
Dr. Mai, can you make sure you close the mic, please, for the translation and the online? Just get a bit closer to the mic.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, let's start again. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this discussion. We're going to talk today about the socioeconomic impacts of the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the vulnerable families and children in Egypt. This is the outline for the presentations. We're going to talk about introduction and then the impact on cost of living and poverty, the impact on food security, and then we're going to talk briefly on the impact on migrants, refugees, and then we'll talk about the government responses toward the crisis and our thoughts about the policy recommendations. Unfortunately, in the last decade in Egypt has been experiencing several shocks that started with 2011 and then it continued afterward. Afterward, we faced several liberalization of the exchange rate, and maybe in 2016, 2017, actually the Egyptian pound lost about 50% of its value. Just afterward, the whole world, not only the Egyptian economy, faced another challenge, which was the COVID-19. We faced closure and the slowdown of the economy in the whole world. While the whole world was trying to recover from the COVID-19 consequences, another hit was the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, which was in 2022. And its impact, it affected the whole world. It affected the trade exchange and the rising of the inflation rates. Definitely, the impact was even higher among vulnerable countries and developing countries, third world countries, and even more for those countries who relied heavily on importing goods from these countries. And just recently, in the last month, Egypt has faced another devaluation in the Egyptian pound, which lost around maybe 20 or 25% of its value again. Okay, why do we care about the Ukraine-Russia crisis? Actually, Egypt, Ukraine, and Russia has strong relation just before the crisis. First of all, the wheat. Egypt sourced about 80% of its wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia. The second thing that we rely heavily on them, the tourism, where actually 30% of the tourists actually were coming from Ukraine and Russia. And the third dimension, which is very important, the FDI. One of the most important destinations for Russia's FDI in coal, oil, and gas is Egypt. On the other hand, Egypt relies on Russia for about 30 to 60% of its FDI in energy, which made matters more complicated for the Egyptian economy after the crisis. So these are the three dimensions that are important to the Egyptian economy as consequences for the crisis. Okay, let's start with the wheat, which is very important because it's considered strategic food in Egypt, and it's a basic component of the bread and all the Egyptian households depend on in their day-to-day food consumption. On the left, you see the change that happened in the volume and the value in the imports of wheat in the last 6 months. And as you see, the value decreased, especially as just before the crisis and after the crisis. When we look at the volume itself, in 2021, we relied heavily on Russia and Ukraine. Maybe the share of Ukraine was less than the Russian share. And just after the crisis, the Ukrainian share decreased. There was a lot of decrease in the share. Maybe the Russian share didn't decrease as much, but the good thing actually that Egypt tried to find other sources to import wheat from, and this is the reason that the other countries' share increased. But this gives an idea about how much we depended on both Ukraine and Russia on importing wheat. As mentioned before, according to the World Bank estimates, for every 1 point increase in food prices, 10 million people fall into extreme poverty. So the cost of living is very important to be considered when we study poverty and food insecurity. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has different impact on different countries, depending on the vulnerability and dependence on imported food and other commodities. And definitely, as I mentioned before, Egypt as a developing country and imports wheat from both countries, its impact should be studied. It's expected that the inflation and the increase of fuel prices will more likely affect developing countries, especially those, as I mentioned, rely on imported wheat. And a simulation, actually, EFRI made a simulation study in order to study the impact of price increase on food, fuel, and fertilizers prices on household consumption. Egypt was one of these countries, and they found that the impact on real household consumption is not, the decline won't be more than 0.9%. However, the headcount poverty rate might increase by 1.8%. This is a result of a simulation given all other variables constant. Okay, in order to see more about the cost of living and poverty, we need to see the consumer price index just before the crisis started and the poverty rates but just before the crisis. As you see, in 2016-17, there was a peak in the consumer price index where it increased by about 20 percentage points. The poverty rate in 2017-18 was 32.5, which is much higher than 2015. So just after the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, the poverty rate increased. However, after that, the increase in the CPI started to decrease, the increasing rate started to decrease, so there was some stability in the consumer price index. And with the initiative of the government in the social protection programs with the Takaful and Krama, we can see there was a decline in the poverty rate afterward in 2019, which reached 29.7. However, it's still higher than 2015. What we can say from that, we need to consider that inflation, the increase in inflation will have an impact on the poverty. So it can be observed here in the last year, when we consider only the last year CPI and inflation rates, starting from January till August 2022, compared with the same month in the previous year, we see obviously there was a peak just after the crisis in April and May, in both inflation rate definitely and the CPI as well. Although it started to decrease slightly afterward, but by August 2020, it started to increase again, and it's expected to increase again, given the changes that happened in the value of the Egyptian pound. What else can we notice here? We can notice that the CPI inflation rate in rural area, is even higher than urban areas. And as we know, rural areas in Egypt suffer more from the poverty than urban areas, so we need to put more effort in these areas. By looking at the inflation rates and the CPI only for food, during the same period, it appears that Egypt suffered from an escalating food inflation during the last months. As a result of the overall increasing prices, and especially the food prices, food consumption may decrease among almost all households in Egypt, whether they are Egyptian or non-Egyptian, which may possibly lead to malnutrition deficiency for children, but definitely this will be on the long run, not the short run. But the food insecurity, we must consider this in our study. Okay. We wanted to look closely to the inflation rate for certain food groups. This is in August 2022 compared to 2021. What we can see here, we can see that there's high increase in the bread and cereal with about 50% increase. Again, the increase is more pronounced in the rural area than the urban area. Meat also increased. Seafood increased, dairy, milk, cheese, and eggs increased. The only thing that slightly didn't change, or let's say the change was much less, were the vegetables and the fruits. The impact of the inflation and the increase of the prices will definitely be more obvious among the vulnerable groups. The vulnerable groups actually here in Egypt will be poor household with children and refugees. Unfortunately, we don't have enough data that can study the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the vulnerable groups, but what we can look at, we can look at the conditions of the poor households with children in Egypt and the refugees' conditions in Egypt, and highlight the risk that they are in right now, and see what will happen if the government doesn't respond quickly to this crisis and make actions in order to help these vulnerable groups. In order to see this, the impact on children and the past and expected scenarios and the refugees, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Nassim.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, as Dr. Mai said, that there lack of data or there is no data after the crisis. So we will have two scenarios: past scenario and expected scenario for the impact of crisis on the children. This slide shows that the percentage of households with children by poverty status and year. You can find here that among the extremely poor households, there are 95% of them have a children, and in 2019, while there is the percentage is 96.7% of household have a children in 2017. This maybe means that almost of household almost the most of household poor households have children. To know more about the poor households that have children, let's talk about the share of food for poor individuals in the household with the children by year. From this slide, we can see that the food share declined in 2019 by around 4%, compared with 2017. And the consumption patterns or the share of selected food groups to food expenditure increased in 2019 for these selected food groups in comparison to 2017. Why we choose these selected food groups? Because we think that these food groups are more important or important for growing up children. There's only one group that decreased the food share, which is meat group. But here we can't say that we can't say that it's bad or negative or bad or good impact or bad or good sign. We need to know more about them by calculating for example, the average per capita expenditure using constant prices. So let's move to the next slide. The average per capita expenditure on food, for example, per month for individuals in poor household have children, we found that there is the decreasing in this per capita, in this average per capita expenditure over the time. While in vegetables, there is a stability in average, there is stability or the same over time for average per capita expenditure on the vegetables per month. The same as for dairy products and for fruits. There is an decreasing in average per capita expenditure for these groups. From here, we can say that the poor children or the poor household have children need more support from the government or from other people to support them and improve their life. Let's go to the another groups that vulnerable groups, such as migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Here in Egypt, due to its geographical location, Egypt plays an important role for important role as a post-destination country and the transit country for migrants, for refugees and asylum seekers from other part of Africa and from MENA region. The last 10 years, we can find that the last 10 years has in the last 10 years, there is a political instability in the region. You can find that there is a conflict in Sudan and Syria and also in Yemen. This may lead to increase the number of refugees the number of refugees in Egypt. In October 2022, the United Nations reported that the number of refugees in Egypt, registered number of refugees in Egypt, was 288,173. Almost half of them are from Syria and 28 of them are from Sudan. Children constitute around 37% of the refugees in Egypt. In addition to the registered refugees, there is also undocumented refugees. There are Egypt hosts an estimate of at least 750,000 undocumented migrants. UNHCR in 2019 conducted the Egypt vulnerability assessment for refugees to collect more information about those refugees and identify their vulnerabilities in Egypt. The study found that 27% of the refugees had poor access to food, and 6 out of 10 were vulnerable to food insecurity. And refugees who were receiving WFP food vouchers were less likely to be food insecure. So this group also need more support for them. From here, the role of governments comes. In March 2022, the government banned the export of basic food commodities such as wheat, flour, and oil and corns for 3 months. Egypt started also negotiation with other countries, for example, to import wheat, for example, from France, India, and Portugal. The government has decided to expand the existing Takaful and Karama program to cover an additional 500,000 households. So here the Takaful and Karama program and the ration card programs are still play a protective factor for poor household and poor children. Let's see that how Takaful and Karama program help poor people. We found that there were 20% of extreme poor household in 2017 are covered receiving Takaful and Karama program, receiving cash transfer from Takaful and Karama program. While in 2019 there was 25.6% of household receiving Takaful and Karama cash transfer program. Also in urban areas, we can find that 11.5% of this household received تكافل and كرامة cash transfer, while in 2019 there was 17.9%, which means that one can say that there are more coverage, but still for 74% of extremely poor households who have children under 18 didn't receive support from تكافل and كرامة program in 2019, from hikes 2019. For ration cards also, the food security and the food subsidies are one of the factors that contributing in reducing poverty, or especially food poverty. It is noticed that 92% of the extremely poor household which have children have a ration cards, while this percentage was 91.8% in 2019. And it is observed that for non-poor households, the percentage of the household have a ration card is 85%, and in 2017, while in 2019 the percentage was 77% for this for households that receiving ration card, which we need to revisit or revisit this household and decrease this number or this percentage. Here are the policy recommendations. We divided them into two parts: build more resilient agri-food system in Egypt and support the most vulnerable groups. We, as Dr. Mai mentioned, for data, we need more data after the crisis, especially after the crisis, under supervision, for example, Ministry of Planning or Ministry of Social Solidarities, to help those vulnerable groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mai and Nesma. It's now time to give the floor to our lead commentator, Dr. Shireen Al-Shawarbi, Professor of Economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science. A lot of us around this table and online know Dr. Shireen Al-Shawarbi. She's well-distinguished professor of economics. She's been dean of the Faculty of Economics and Political Science in Future University during the period 2020 to 2022, and the vice dean of the Faculty of Economics and Political Science in Cairo University from 2015 and 2016. She served in a number of policy maker type positions. She's been deputy minister for economic justice at the Ministry of Finance between 2014 and 2015, senior economist at the World Bank for quite a period of time in the early 2000s till 2013, widely published, well recognized. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Shireen Al-Shawarbi. And I'm advised by my colleagues at UNICEF, there's a figure that we're just double checking on the total number of migrants that we will be updating you with in a few moments. Dr. Shireen, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and the pleasure is mine, Shireen, to be with you. It's always a pleasure to be among the ERF fellows and to be part of your activities. And thank you for the authors. This is a good topic to discuss. And I think maybe the government is keen to listen to what is possible to be done in such, I think, difficult time in our history. Dr. May is one of my favorite colleagues in Cairo University, and I find it a bit difficult to criticize the paper, but this is my role. And I think my role is to help you improving this paper. So I will not go into the details that we can discuss later, but basically I think one one important thing that many researchers maybe skip is to revise the paper after finishing it and to leave it apart for a while and then come back to it to see whether the flow is easy to follow and it's consistent and coherent. So maybe some proofreading is needed, and I will tell you why I think so. So basically, when I read the agenda and the concept note, I thought that this would be about a policy brief, and then I found it as a policy paper. But in both cases, you need to have a policy question. This is a policy paper and not a policy brief. A policy brief should be just 1-2 pages maximum. So we have a policy paper, but I doubt I got the right policy question. I don't know what is the policy question. In a policy paper, it would be good for a policymaker to look at one specific question policy. You're addressing the socio-economic impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war. This is good for a report, I think, but not for a policy paper. The policy paper seeks to provide some policy recommendations, implementable, and you provide like alternative sets of policies. These are the available sets of policies that you can follow, but my recommendation is to follow this specific set because of, and then you provide the arguments. Unfortunately, this is not the case. We have very broad policy recommendations that any policymaker will tell you, I know all of this, nothing new. So for a policymaker to use and to look at, the first thing he will do is to look at the policy recommendations. If the policy recommendations are very broad, too broad actually, then no need to waste my time reading the policy paper. But the first thing is to focus. And I liked in the presentation that at least you skipped the macroeconomic part, the macroeconomic impact. But you have to see whether you want to address the poverty impact or you want to address the nutritional impact, because they are different and it will take you, if you want to go in depth and provide policy measures, recommendations, then you have to focus on one of these two questions. One more thing is the amount of statistics that are provided, because you're statisticians, so you're keen to provide statistics. But we need to focus on those that are really relevant to your arguments. You bring all the statistics to give strength to your argument and to support them. However, in all cases, you have the statistics, but at each time I say, so what? I don't know how this strengthens, and what is your proposition? What is your stance? What is your conclusion out of this? This is more important than just providing statistics. I was confused by the insistence every time to mention inflation, to associate this with the CPI. The change in the CPI is the inflation, and we look at the inflation rates. Why should I waste my time looking at upward trending of CPIs that are translated at the end by inflation rates going up? And so exclude the CPI, get it out of your paper. Focus on the inflation rates. But then you say that, and the comparison between 2015, 2017, 18, and 2019, 20. There should be a purpose of making comparison across 3 points of time. If you want to say what happened before when inflation was really high, then you have the moment of 30% inflation. This happened in 2008. This happened in 2017, 18. We had very high inflation. What was the consequence of this on poverty? Or we don't have this on nutrition in hikes. So I'm trying to be helpful with using the hikes. So you just confine your comparison to these periods, to these years. But you keep mentioning 2019, 2020. This was a kind of improvement in poverty, decline in inflation. It doesn't have anything to do with your story that you want to bring out and to say that this what happened, and we expect this to happen again because of increasing inflation this time. As what I saw was like making comparison of 3 years, and I don't know what is the story, what is the conclusion, what is the message that you want to convey. I didn't get the message. So you need to focus the history and then the expectations, not necessarily to mention what happened every single step in 2019, 2020. When you say the economic justifications need to be revised, because sometimes you say that in 2019, 2020, the share of food to total expenditure declined because the consumers tend to like substitute other things. This is not true. This is my understanding, and you have to show this more from with the data. In 2019, 2020, per capita expenditure increased, real per capita expenditure increased. And I was wondering, and I was looking at Dr. Hiba, because we have been writing many papers together. Dr. Dina was writing with Dr. Hiba. And I mean, I was a bit surprised why we have in this presentation some numbers that are not consistent. Dr. Heba told me that maybe this is because you used a different sample, but you should have mentioned this. You used the full sample. At least you tell us why the numbers would not be consistent with what we have as per capita expenditure in 2019, 2020 increased, and that's why poverty declined in 2019, 2020. When your per capita income increase, when expenditure increase, this means that the share of food may decline out of your total expenditure. This is the angle, curve. This is what we know in economics, but it's not because of a substitution effect. Also, when you have increase in prices, you have two effects. You have the substitution, but you have also the income effect. You don't mention this. So when you have some economic justification, I would hope that you refer to an economist to make sure that your justification, you will have your turn to answer. So I think you need to consult with someone like Dr. Heba. Every time I write something away from Dr. Heba, I go back to her and tell her, are these numbers correct? Because I need to make sure that what I'm writing is consistent. No one will come to argue a number. When you talk about takaful and karama, and I'm talking now about policies, so the policies that you're looking at are either you said, and I like the presentation more than what was written in the paper. You skipped the parts talking about GDP and production because you didn't mention this in the paper. So we don't recommend something that we do not address in the paper. But with takaful and karama, it's like you're saying that you have two social or two kind of social safety net programs, takaful and karama and ration cards, right? I wish first, takaful and karama, you said it in the presentation and in the paper that because of takaful and karama, poverty declined in 2019, 2020. Not all the poverty decline was due to takaful and karama. So this should be clearly, explicitly said. You convey a wrong message here. You said we need to, the government need to put more effort in targeting rural areas because this is where The government actually, Haya Karima, is about rural areas. The Takaful and Karama basically targets households in rural areas in Upper Egypt where poverty is the highest. So is this a useful recommendation to provide? No. This is what, but is this sufficient? Actually not. So what to do? This is what was not mentioned in the paper. Do we need to increase the coverage? And you have to go to the Ministry of Social Solidarity to make sure that the 4.6 million households that will be covered next month, this is like the maximum number they can cover now because they responded to all applicants. After verifying their eligibility, 4.6 million households is like the maximum. So what to do next? I mean, you need to help them with the problem they face, not with the problem we think we have. The other one was the ration cards. Again, will you recommend to expand the coverage of ration cards or the Takaful and Karama, given that both are like cash transfers? What is your position with the middle income class? They are suffering, but the ration cards address their needs, not the Takaful and Karama. So you need to make a balance. We had a paper, we can share it with you, Dr. Heba and I, and we propose the different scenarios of reforming Baladi bread and ration cards so as to make more, to find a kind of fiscal space to finance the coverage of more coverage, wider coverage of Takaful and Karam. What will happen? So what will happen if you increase the coverage of, or you, not the coverage, the benefits of ration cards? So this is the kinds of thing a policymaker needs, not to tell them, you need to look to better target and to, there should be a specific problem with targeting that you know, and you know the alternative policies to follow to improve this targeting. So this is what I did not find in the paper. I think this is, in a nutshell, a way to write a better policy paper if you want policymakers to look at it and to make use of it. I have other comments in the paper. I will give you the paper if you can read my remarks, and I'll be more than happy to help you after the meeting, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shireen, much appreciated. Excellent comments. Can I give the floor to Dr. May and Nisma for some initial reactions before we move into our next session? Dr. May?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shireen, for the great comments. I hope I can remember answering all these comments. So let me start with the CPI and inflation rate. I totally agree. Actually, we excluded some of the figures. So I believe that we should exclude more than this. Yani, let's focus either on the CPI. Some of them were excluded, but I totally agree because I think they reflect just the same thing. On the other hand, let me start with one very important point regarding the decrease in real prices, because I want to make sure whether you measured this for poor households with children or in general. In general or the poor ones? Because I mean, maybe in general, it differs than the poor.
So one thing, you say that the share of
we didn't conclude anything.
The share of households with children among the poor is,
yeah.
This is not as useful as saying that these are the poor, all right? So it's high, the share of households with children. Definitely it's high.
Yeah, we know.
Because poverty.
Yes.
It's not, because household with children in the population is high.
Yes.
you need to put the two against each other to show whether the poverty rate is much higher within households with children compared to in the population.
Yes, that was mentioned too.
Sometimes you miss the comparison, the reference.
Okay. We
points.
focused actually about that. We focus mainly on the trend. So this is what the percentage of poor and extreme poor among households with children is also mentioned in the paper. But we wanted to highlight the fact that the vulnerable groups are those with the most vulnerable groups are the poor with children. They constitute high percentage of the poor households in Egypt. This is what we wanted to highlight. We didn't. The main idea wasn't to seek causality between, for instance, the decline in the poverty rate and takaful and karama. We didn't seek causality, but we just observing that with the initiation of the takaful and karama and the minimum wage, there was a decline or decrease in the poverty rate. So we didn't do like more than this in analysis, just like highlighting the facts. This is what's happening. We didn't seek any causality between both. Why we're doing this? We're using descriptive data to highlight the households at risk, and given the increase in the inflation rates, those are the most vulnerable groups. Those are the most needed actions. So this is what was the purpose of the paper. On the other hand, the recommendations in the paper were not properly actually mentioned in the draft that you have received, and this is the reason that in the presentation, if you see, we have more recommendations. And I believe the purpose of the meeting and the discussion today and tomorrow is to discuss which of these recommendations actually is more effective, which one is can be improved, and which one can be excluded, and so on. And tomorrow we're going to have another round with people from different governmental entities that can maybe guide us in the recommendations. On the other hand, the food share. Why we're mentioning the food share? I know, I mean, we cannot say anything about the food share. It's declining. It's not, there's no certain conclusion about it. But I mean, we cannot conclude anything. They may substitute healthy, expensive food with unhealthy, cheaper food. We don't know. I don't know exactly what's happening. I don't have more information. Whether the pattern itself will change by how much, I don't have this information, but this is also to highlight the fact that we need to know the pattern of goods that they are using, and whether they are substituting healthy, expensive food with unhealthy, cheap food, and how this may affect on the long run the malnutrition for households and children or not. This is only to highlight this fact. The other thing, I totally agree with you that we need to focus on the history, and based on the history, what should we expect? And the reason that we focused only in 2015, 2017, and then 2019, because this is the last decade. This is maybe we have 2012 before that, but we needed to focus just before the devaluation and just after the devaluation that happened, because this is the most devaluation that happened. It's really affected the inflation rate, and it peaked the CPI at this point of time. So this was the reason to see the picture. It's not the whole picture. We know this. We know it's not the whole picture. It's only part of the picture. But once we have other data, more in-depth data, or more detailed data, we can see a little bit bigger picture of the case. I don't know whether I answered most of them or.
Thank you very much. Can I come in here? Yes. Let me just say we're very grateful for the input and for this was meant very much to be a scene setting, and that we're today is a very much research focused approach to the material we have at hand. It's by no means an end product. It was meant to bring on board all the perspectives that are being set forward. So I think during the course of the day, we'd be able to unpack all the issues and look into what has been addressed and what needs to be addressed. And so we keep to our schedule. And I think we can come back to some of the issues raised in the open discussion later this afternoon. What is planned for now is that Peter is going to take on the moderation for the next session to continue what can research tell us about the impact of the crisis. And I think we've noted a lot of what Dr. Shireen had said. Yes?
The coming sessions, I would like to see if there are other comments from the participants on why are you excluding this option of having the reflections.
We're not. I'm just following. No, not. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to stick to the agenda. The way the agenda was set was exactly as follows: that Dr. May and Nisma would set the scene with the content. Hadratik, you'd come in and challenge and look into the critical aspects, and then we have a panel that Peter is going to be moderating with some input from Dr. Shahir Zaki, from our friend Ms. Alison Farey, and from Dr. Hiba Al-Laisi, whom I'm sure will bring out a lot more issues. Then we have almost an hour to really recap on everything. I just wanted to give my a little chance to react for that, and then we'll actually be addressing this in the session to follow. But you're not leaving us. You're with us till we bring that to closure. Yes. We're going to talk about different research aspects, and then the following session, the one that is scheduled at 12:30, is going to be talking about the paper set out from the beginning and the different perspectives as well. Okay, so we're not leaving that. Okay, Peter, can I give you the floor to start the next session, please? And we'll take it from where we are because we felt we don't want to disturb that. So we're seated where we are, and we have with us also Dr. Shahir Zaki. Shahir, you're there? Okay, you're using PPT, excellent. And Ms. Alison Fahey and Dr. Hiba Al-Laisi as well. So
yes,
the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the presentation, and also thank you, Dr. Shireen, for your feedback. I think it's important to highlight that these this analysis was done also at a very compressed time, and it's the idea is that today, tomorrow, but also later on, if there's going to be new evidence available, we feed into this policy document as well. It doesn't end tomorrow. And also the team did not do any analysis on the micro data. So it was more of capturing some of basic descriptive information that we have at this point in time. Let me also tell you that there are other pieces of analysis that we've been working on, and we've been working on this with Professor Ebeliti and the Professor Dinar Manius, which will coming up. Well, there is already some draft analysis ready, then it should come out soon, which will look a bit more in details about the impact of inflation, different inflation scenarios on poverty and other indicators important to vulnerable families and children. So this can complement, it can be an additional piece to understanding the impacts and also to understand what can be done. Now, we have three panelists. If I allow me to do just a quick introduction, because now we are sitting in different places. So we're going to start with Professor Shahir Zaki. He's Professor of Economics, Faculty of Economical and Political Science. He's also lead economist at the RF. He's been working with several international organizations, including the World Bank, and his work has been mostly focused on international trade policy, trading services, and applied economics. So in a couple of seconds, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then probably that's going to be how you, how you are presenting your slides. And that's over there. Then we have Alison Fahy. She's Executive Director of JPAL, Middle East and North Africa. She leads the JPAL regional office based at the American University in Cairo. And she leads all the strategic and growth of the office on research, policy, and capacity building. Before working with JPAL, she's been working with USAID in Afghanistan and Jordan, and World Bank in Indonesia. She has an MPA in international development from Princeton University. So thanks again for joining us. As UNICEF, we are also working with JPAL, and it's good to see everybody that we know and work with around the table. Professor Ebeliti, I'm not sure I need to really introduce her, but as I've done for my colleagues, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to try and capture a few important aspects of your profile and your experience. She's a professor of statistics at Faculty of FEPS, Faculty of Economic and Political Science, University of Cairo. She has been heading the statistical department at FEPS between 2009 and 12. She's the lead consultant for CAPMAS on poverty and living standard measurement, and she's specialized in micro data analysis. And she's one of the key experts also sitting around the table working on poverty. We are also happy that we've been working with her. We are working with her right now. We worked also in the past, and I think Professor Shireen also mentioned an interesting analysis that it was done as part of a collaboration with Information Decision Support Center recently, just last year and finished this year, that includes different scenarios for social protection reform, food subsidies, and cash transfers. So after this brief introduction, we have a couple of questions that can lead the inputs from the panelists. So for Dr. Shahir, I think also based on your expertise, basically the question is if you can address during the presentation, but also a few minutes, after some additional remarks about how in your opinion, and what data tell us about the resilience of the Egypt economy at macro, meso, and micro levels. What, from your point of view, are the impact of the crisis in the short, medium, and long term, and also if you can address the hot topic, which is the IMF loan, and to what extent this new collaboration with the IMF can contribute to macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability as well. Now, this is the first part. If you can focus a bit on the overall scenario, but then wherever possible, try to provide. This roundtable is really about providing ideas and policy measures. So feel free to propose ideas that we can discuss as well. So policy measures. So over to you, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Peter, very much, and thank you for inviting me to present the impact of the crisis from the macro perspective. So I will speak for like 5 to 7 minutes about different points regarding the impact of the crisis at the macro level. And I will just divide this into 3 main points: why specifically Egypt is an interesting case to study compared to other countries, to what extent the economy was suffering from mainly other structural imbalances that amplify the effect of this crisis, and finally, to address perhaps the last point, especially when it comes to the loan of the IMF, what are the main recommendations for the way forward. So why Egypt? For at least 3 reasons. It's interesting because, as it was mentioned in the first presentation by May and Nesma, that Egypt is the largest importer, as you can see, of cereals and other products from Russia and Ukraine. So as you can see here in these 2 graphs, Egypt has the largest share of cereal imports at the African level compared to all countries. And this highest share comes from both Russia and Ukraine. So both of them, they represent around 2/3 of Egypt's imports of cereals. And this is an average over the last 5 years. The second case why Egypt also is interesting, or that explains why the crisis in Egypt is particular, is that in general, the tourism sector is an important contributor to the economic activity, and most of the tourists around, in general, both Russians and Ukraine, they represent almost 1/3 of the tourists in Egypt, and which will put further pressure on the sources of foreign currency, in addition to the decrease in FDI that decreased from around 3% to 1.5% of GDP. So this means that in general, there is a further pressure on foreign reserves, and this explains why, in addition to the debt service that has to be paid and the principal of the debt itself, foreign reserves declined from around 42 billion US dollar to around 33 billion US dollar. And this clearly was associated to the third reason that explains why the crisis in Egypt is particular, because despite the currency devaluation that we had in 2016, we had another series of devaluations in 2022 that led to the increase in inflation, as it was presented by, discussed by Dr. Shireen and presented by Dr. May and Dr. Nisma. And clearly, this was associated to an increase in poverty, because so far, the official figures of poverty, they show that it represents around 30%. 30% of the population is already below the poverty line. So those three reasons explain why specifically the case of Egypt is of interest now. And what I'm trying to argue in this, through this short intervention, is to explain to what extent those cyclical factors, when it comes to the decrease in tourism, the decrease in FDI, or the decrease in even exports because of the decline in the world demand in general, were mainly amplified because of existing structural imbalances in the economy that made the economy perhaps at the macro level more resilient, but at the structural level, those characteristics have not been addressed despite the implementation of several economic reforms programs. And I will summarize this in 4 main points. So the first point is that growth in Egypt has been mainly led by capital-intensive sectors, in the sense that mainly when we look at the evolution of growth before and after the pandemic, growth was mainly led by sectors that are more intensive in capital, like the construction sector, oil, petroleum products, and so on. And this explains why, despite the macroeconomic resilience that we had a positive economic growth during the pandemic, and to a certain extent even after the war in Ukraine, this was not really translated into more job creation or more, from a social perspective, more social resilience, if I can say it, at the macro level. The second reason is that perhaps there is also, all these cyclical factors have been amplified by the fact that the private sector was really negatively affected, its growth has not been as expected as it should have been during the previous 10 years. So this graph shows that the domestic credit that goes to the private sector from the banking sector in general decreased from almost 40% to slightly less than 20%. And at the same time, the credit that goes to the government from the banking sector has been increasing from 40% to more than 60%. It can be explained by some supply-driven factors, some demand-driven factors, but what we can see is that in general, there is more limited liquidity that is made available for the private sector, which in this case can hinder investment and consequently growth and job creation. So that's why at the same time, this can partially explain also why firms are not able to expand, and if they cannot expand, they cannot produce, they cannot export, and this means that in this case, another important source of foreign currency is negatively affected from a structural perspective, not from a cyclical perspective. Third, that also can explain why the private sector has not been able to expand. And again, it's a structural characteristic that made the Egyptian economy perhaps resilient at the macro level, but not very resilient from a structural perspective, is in general the deteriorating investment climate when it comes to the tax management, the tax rates, practices coming from the informal sector, competition policy, corruption, the time to start a business or to enforce contracts. So all this shows to what extent the private sector has been facing several impediments in the economy, and then was not able to expand and consequently to produce or to generate jobs and to export. In addition to all that, we had also a more fragile external position. So as you can see here, the external debt stock has been increasing exponentially starting 2011, and then the service of the debt has been increasing, and the share of the debt to foreign reserves has been also increasing. So all this made the external position even more fragile now, and this has been amplified by the war in Ukraine. So that's why, bearing in mind those cyclical characteristics that we have in terms of the decrease of tourism, the decrease in FDI, or the decrease in exports, along with the deeper structural imbalances that we have in the economy, I think for the way forward, especially with the new IMF loan, the main problem, and we can discuss this later perhaps to keep my time. So the main problem, I think, in the policy conception and implementation in the Egyptian case was that it was very much focusing on macroeconomic stabilization, in the sense that one of the top priorities was to improve the macroeconomic aggregates. So in terms of the decrease of fiscal deficit, the decrease in inflation, decrease in unemployment, increase in economic growth, and all this took place between 2016 and 2019. And this made the economy very resilient at the macro level during the pandemic, and to a lesser extent during the war in Ukraine. But the problem is that most of these policies that have been focusing primarily on the short term, because they are by nature stabilization policies, other structural policies that really have to address the structural problems that the economy is suffering from, which is the decrease in competition, the small share of the private sector that is declining, all the impediments that hinder exports and investment. So all this has to be addressed, but from a structural perspective, and which means that in this case, we need to change, to have a paradigm shift from the stabilization policies approach to more structural or allocation policies approach. Because I think, and I think Dr. Shin will agree on this point, that whenever we focus a lot on stabilization policies that might be perhaps optimal in the short term, this will deviate from the long-term equilibrium. And that's what we call in economics in general, time inconsistency, in the sense that we might adopt several policies that can be beneficial in the short term because they are stabilization policies and they will help stabilize the economy. But these policies that perhaps are optimal in the short term, they will not be optimal in the long term. And we will deviate even further from the long-term equilibrium. And I think this is very important with the new IMF loan, because if with the new IMF loan, we will still adopt similar stabilization policies that have been adopted in 2016, without really addressing all these structural imbalances of the economy, it will be again another cycle where the economy improves in the short term, then we have some problems in the medium term, then we get a new loan, and so on and so forth. And this will increase the dependency vis-a-vis the IMF loan, which has been evidenced in the literature, especially on African countries. So I think that's why when it comes to the recommendations, most of my recommendations will be mainly more structural rather than cyclical, in the sense that in order to really increase the resilience of the economy, I think for now it's mainly an issue of helping the private sector expand in terms of investment, exports, job creation. And without addressing all the impediments that hinder the private sector, I don't think that the IMF loan will really help the Egyptian economy improve its status, neither in the medium term nor in the long term. And one final point, and this is also from a structural perspective, I think that spending priorities from a fiscal perspective have also to change, because most of our spending is current. And why it's current? Because it's mainly on subsidies, wages, the debt of the service of the debt, and at the same time productive spending or spending on human capital, which is mainly again structural, not cyclical, affects labor, affects in general outcomes, social outcomes in the economy when it comes to education, health, or human capital infrastructure, if I can call it this way. And this will clearly help the economy address more structural issues. Perhaps I will stop here and we can talk about other recommendations later. And thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks, Sherry. I think really interesting. So basically, if I can, let's say, just some reflection on this point. So basically, what you're saying is that, well, the crisis had an impact on, we talked about tourism, we talked about foreign reserves, but these impacts have been amplified by some structural inefficiency in the Egyptian economy. And you mentioned the type of growth, you mentioned private sector, you mentioned the fragile external position of the country. And I think your recommendations are pretty clear. We need to fix the foundation of the Egyptian economy rather than on focusing only on some macroeconomic indicators such as the fiscal deficits and so on. Another very interesting point is about, I think you mentioned human capital infrastructure. I like it. I like it. It really gives an idea that investing in education, in health, it's clear an investment, and it's important to build the foundation of a country. So I think very clear, and also your point about moving from stabilization to a more structural approach. And I think I take your critiques also on the IMF. I don't think we have many details still. I mean, there are some, I don't think that it's officially approved yet, the IMF loans, as far as I know. I think it will be approved this month by the board. And hopefully, from what I hear, there is an aspect, it's a very important focus on private sector. So hopefully that would help tackling some of these inefficiency in the economy. So thank you, Shari. I lost Shari. Yes, sorry. I thought you didn't want to hear my summary of this. All right, good. Thank you very much. So maybe we are going to have some question afterwards on for Shari, but also for Professor May. Alison, would you, you want to stay there? You're okay there? So I already introduced Alison, and let me also highlight that some of the work that we've been doing with JPAL has been focusing on global evidence and how the global evidence on many areas of child well-being can help the government of Egypt in learning, in coming up with policy to address some of the major challenges that Egypt is facing. At the same time, JPAL is also starting several initiatives, several research projects, several impact evaluation projects with the government, and also they've launched the Egypt Impact Lab together with the Ministry of Planning and several other partners, including MOS, including NCW, MESMEDA, as I said, all, yes, which aim at creating, building national evidence on the large programs that the government is implementing. So we are happy also to be supporting this initiative as well. So the first question is really linking to as UNICEF initial collaboration about the global evidence. So if you can give us some ideas about what the global evidence tell us about this kind of crisis and the impact on children and vulnerable families, and also again, let's focus also on the lessons on some of the policy practices that can contribute in addressing these impacts.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. And thank you for welcoming me here. It's wonderful to learn about the new partnership between UNICEF and ERF. And I think as JPAL, we're very enthusiastic about the idea of trying to bring evidence and data into the policy discussion, especially in response to rapidly shifting conditions on the ground in the face of a crisis like this one that we're seeing this year. So very briefly, for those, I think many of you at this point now know JPAL. We've been around in Egypt now for a couple of years, but for those who are maybe meeting us for the first time, I'll give you a very brief overview and then turn to the question. So the mission of JPAL is to, JPAL, which is the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, is to reduce poverty by trying to ensure that policy is informed by rigorous and scientific evidence. And so what I hope we can bring kind of into this dialogue and into the policy making process is evidence coming from randomized evaluations, which we conduct around the world and increasingly in Egypt and in the MENA region with policy partners. So we're working on evaluating actual programs, actual policies being implemented by government or by NGOs, and working together with affiliated professors who are now more than 300 people in the JPAL network. This is more than 300 or so of the world's kind of leading development economists who we're working with. And so what we do as JPAL, in addition to conducting that research, is to try to synthesize the results that are emerging from bodies of research to offer policy recommendations in these sorts of discussions. As Peter said, we earlier this year launched the Egypt Impact Lab with the Ministry of Planning and several other partners. And we're yet to launch our first set of evaluations under the lab, though we will in the spring of next year. And my hope is that many of those evaluations will actually help to get at what is the impact of some of the sorts of policies that we're talking about today. So shifting to the global evidence on impact, and I think the way that I've divided up my response a bit is to think about evidence to support the immediate response to crisis, sort of policy options. And then I think in response to the second question from Peter, we'll think a bit more about what the evidence says around efforts to try to promote resilience in a longer term way to be more resilient to future shocks. We don't know what they'll be, but we certainly know they will come. So in terms of immediate evidence, as Jeremy laid out and Dr. May and Dr. Nesma kind of elaborated, the nature of this crisis is a nutrition crisis, especially for vulnerable households and for children. So I'll try to focus a bit on what we know from the global evidence there. And here I'm drawing on a synthesis of more than probably 50 randomized evaluations looking at, I think, 3 different related interventions on nutrition and on health. So cash transfers, which are not exclusively focused on nutrition, but certainly have nutrition impacts, in-kind food transfers, and then vouchers. And in thinking about the global evidence on these and how to think through the mix of policies that might make sense to implement, I think what's important to note is that there are different trade-offs in terms of nutrition impacts, but there are also trade-offs in terms of operational feasibility, the ability to scale quickly in response to crisis, and cost and cost efficiency. So first, I'm thinking about cash transfers, and here, I think as we all know, there's a really rich global literature on the impact of cash transfers, but notably cash transfers, whether conditional or unconditional, do pretty consistently improve food intake and nutrition for children and for infants. And so here, I think this is just to say that the kind of government investment into Kafala and Karama and in cash transfers has, strong global evidence to support going in that direction in terms of impacts on the quantity of food consumption and on diet diversity. And this includes the impact on children's health for food transfer or cash transfers that are delivered to pregnant and expecting mothers all the way through the early childhood period. In-kind food, obviously, in delivering food itself, also is associated with improving food consumption and diet diversity, although we note that there are more limited effects on anthropometric outcomes like weight and height for age over time with in-kind food transfers. However, in the face of a crisis like this, where we want to reach children and reach them quickly, thinking about the feasibility of in-kind food transfers certainly should be on the table. I think one of the things I noted in the policy recommendations was on considering the potential of expanding school-based delivery of food. And this is a place that, as JPAL, I think that we find that there's a lot of evidence to support the kind of direct delivery mechanism within schools. And so it's a place that we'd be interested in exploring a bit further with MOS, with some of their early childhood development and school feeding programs that they're running. So in terms of directly comparing the three, cash transfers, in-kind transfers, and vouchers, they're relatively similar in terms of direct food consumption kind of outcomes. Cash, however, can help to improve other outcomes at the same time. And so there's some additional benefits there. Food transfers have a slightly higher impact on calorie consumption, but they come at a much higher administrative cost. So where these things have been compared directly, the cost of delivering in-kind food was about double the cost of delivering cash transfers. So considerable effects when we think about fiscal space and kind of the options that government is considering there. But ultimately, I think the bottom line here is that all should probably have a place in the sort of social protection policy mix. Cash, though, is probably easier to scale in response to an immediate crisis like the one that kind of we've been facing in the last year. So this idea of expanding Takaful and Karama to an additional 500,000 households, again, is something that probably makes sense in light of the crisis. A couple of other global evidence points, and then I'll pause here, to consider on design. So the first is that there is a considerable evidence on the impact of conditions versus unconditional transfers versus labeled transfers. And so one of the policy ideas that I'd like to suggest is possibly considering loosening conditionality a little bit. There is evidence from randomized evaluation in Morocco suggesting that simply labeling a transfer as being for children's nutrition or for children's education can have as much of a behavioral impact on parents' investments as conditionality. And obviously the conditions require huge administrative capacity to define the conditions, verify they've been met, and determine inclusion or exclusion from the program based on that. So loosening conditions in favor of labeling could be something that could help the government to expand a program like this really quickly to reach more people. And then the second question, I think, on expansion, I think this is something that Dr. Shireen mentioned, is how do we actually target? And some of the things that we heard from Dr. May and Dr. Nisma is that there are extremely poor households that are currently excluded from the mix of programs that are available. So this does raise a question around how to effectively target to reduce those exclusion errors. And here we have evidence from a number of different places around the world on two kind of alternative targeting mechanisms. One is community-based targeting. So this is actually getting members in a village and in a community to identify who the most vulnerable are. And this is recognizing that while we can collect a lot and learn a lot from, proxy means testing and other household surveys, there might be information about vulnerability that communities just have that it's hard to collect in data. And so here we find that community-based targeting performs about the same as proxy means testing in terms of its accuracy on assessing household poverty levels, but comes along with higher community satisfaction because people feel very bought into the process. So this could be something to consider with an expansion, and especially where you're trying to figure out who is newly vulnerable as a result of this crisis or who's long been excluded from targeting. Another option to consider is self-targeting. And so this requires that individuals identify that, I believe I am eligible for this program. And interestingly, we found in research in Indonesia that self-targeting significantly increases the share of the most vulnerable participating in programs, and it reduces the share of ineligible households receiving benefits from social protection programs. I think to a point that Dr. Shireen made earlier, though, with something like ration cards, the goal probably is not to exclude middle-class households, because just because a household is not extremely poor does not mean they're not also suffering right now. So this is not to suggest that the goal there is exclusion of vulnerable but middle-class households, but exclusion of those who do not actually need programs would be one of the corresponding benefits of self-targeting. So I'll pause there, and then maybe we'll have a chance in a minute to talk a bit more about longer-term resilience.
Thanks, Ella. Very clear, very clear. I think it's good that we moved from the macro level recommendation and ideas to build better foundation for the economies to withstand, new crises, because maybe a few years ago, we thought that COVID was just one crisis, and that said we weren't going to get any crisis in the next 20 years. But then a few months after, we realized that we were wrong. To your points, I mean, really, the evidence and your recommendation is really about families, targeting directly families, and also focusing on nutrition and food security. But that's probably one of the largest and more immediate impacts that we will see with the increase of inflation. Also, your comparison among the different modalities, cash transferring, in kind, and voucher, they all contribute, and they probably should all be part of the solution. But then we need to consider the costs in implementing it. Clearly, cash transfer are much less expensive compared to in-kind transfers, including the logistics and so on. You mentioned about the labeling. I think this can also be if the government, the government has, they are announced they will expand, I think, the Takaful and Karama to 4.6 million families, and they are about to do it. I think in the month of December, they will be reaching 4.2 plus an additional 600,000 from NGOs they will be delivering in cash. Is this enough? And maybe we need to make some adjustment as the labeling, for instance, to make sure we can target more families in a shorter period of time. Just an example, this announcement I think was done in July or August, and we're still in December, and they have not reached the 4.6 million families. So these months do matter. Some prices have gone up in the last few months. So this is a real impact on families. Your idea about community-based targeting can be also seen as a way to implement, to expand quickly, and at also low cost. And also the self-targeting. I think it's I think many developed countries actually use self-targeting for these kind of programs. And it's proven to be also very effective in terms of targeting. Another point you raised, and I think also Dr. Shireen mentioned, is about the middle class. Maybe, we know from colleagues also in our office, we know that everybody is suffering. There is an impact of this crisis, not only on the poor, but also on the middle class. Now, the question, and maybe also the audience, we can discuss on this, is would cash transfers be also an answer for the middle class? So we need to think about other approaches as well. So thank you very much. Thanks, Alison. Maybe there are going to be some more questions for you after when we open the floor. To Dr. Heba, again, thanks for joining us again. Will you be there? Or okay. So I think the question for you is also. Okay. And I think with Dr. Heba and Dr. Dina, Dr. Shireen, we've been doing quite a few studies on poverty, also with Professor Eba Nasser on poverty dynamics. I think you have a lot of experience also on. We also worked before on the COVID and the impact of COVID on poverty. So if you can tell us a bit about the impact on the cost of living and how this is affecting the population and the different groups, also how different groups are being affected. And again, because of your work a lot on social protection and creating different scenarios, if you can give us also some ideas. I know that you cannot tell us everything also about the recent study, but give us some hints and some ideas that can sparkle a bit of the discussion here.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, ERF colleagues, for inviting me to present some ideas on the what are the impacts of the food crisis in Egypt. مش سامعة؟ اوكي اقلبها ازاي؟ قولي بس اقلبها، تعالي يا شيرين. اقلبها منين؟ اقلب منين؟ اعمل كده. I think من هنا. Okay. Okay, these are the framework for food security. It has three pillars. One is the availability in quantities. The other one is access to food, and the third one is utilization of food which is available. They added the WFP added another dimension, which is sustainability. That coping strategies should not affect the food security of the households. When we'd like to mention the indicators for food security, we have to look at two things. One is the quantity of food that is available or the household consume, and the other one is the quality of this kind of food. So we look at both dimensions of food security. I'm just going to go very quickly on what happened in the change in food and how it affects the different segments of the population. This slide shows that inflation, it was 23 till 2017, then was declining to 4.5 in 2020, and then started to increase again to 15.3 in May 2020. And of course, the food inflation or food increase in prices derive the overall inflation. And this led us to think that we know that the poor consume, or the budget share of the food budget share is higher than other quintiles or other deciles. So we expected that the impact on inflation on their living standard is much higher, and that this is obvious from these two slides. This is the inflation of the by quintile, and this the right one is the food share by quintiles. The food share is higher for lower quintile. So we expect, because food prices increased much higher, so we expected that the poor will be more hit on the by inflation. And this is actually evidence from the previous experience. In 2000, we tested the change in poverty from 2015 to 18, and we find that the inflation is the leading part of the change in poverty. Poverty between 15 and 17 changed by 4.7 percentage points, and the inflation was 5.6% of the increase was due to inflation, and then the increase in consumption decreased this. This is also obvious from these two slides, which we compare the change in the consumption and change in prices. In between 2015 and 18, the CPI was higher than the increase in consumption. So the actual consumption decreased, and so poverty increased. While in between 2017 and 19, the CPI changed lower than change in consumption. So real consumption increased, and so we observe that poverty has decreased. Okay, these are some data about the overall poverty, but here I'd like to mention that the poverty was 29.7% for all overall population, but for the households with children, it was 33.8. So actually, the households with children are much poorer. Okay. when the in hikes they are in hikes 2018 and also in 2017 they asked about the shocks. What are the kind of shocks that the household experience, and about 77% of the people who experience shocks mentioned that the high inflation rate or the food prices are the main shocks that they suffer. And also we asked them about how they cope with this kind of shocks, and about 90% of them they mentioned that they rely on cheaper food, and or they may reduce the consumption of meat and poultry and reduce the meat size and so on. So all the coping strategies, or most of the coping strategies, will affect their food security. I'm not okay. For the purpose of here, and this is actually what I'm going to present here, is the part of our preliminary results of a report written by Gina Armagnos and myself for the WFP, and I'm going to present some of these results. We tried to simulate what happened, what is the impact of inflation on poverty and on food security. And this is and here I just want to mention that usually, which we did before, we estimate that there is some decline in real consumption, and so poverty will increase or decrease, whatever. But for the purpose of I mean, of estimating the food security, we want to go deeper. We want to know what happened in what change happened in consumption pattern, because households will consume more starches and reduce meat and so on. So we projected us using the elasticities, price on and cross elasticities, and also elasticities on consumption. We estimated what happened in the change in consumption pattern. So we can also know what happened in the food security indicators that we have. Here we applied several scenarios, but I'm presenting here only the current scenario, which is the impact of the current inflation here. And we note that the poverty increased from 30 or 29.7 to 36%, and it's overall all the segments of the population. Poverty increased. Of course, the rate of change might be different, but for all segments of population, poverty increased. Also, we estimated the impact of inflation with and without mitigation, because we know that there is some CC declared some mitigation measures to mitigate the food crisis and so on, or inflation crisis, by expanding the takaful and karama, and also provide the poor pensioners and poor government employers. They give them, I think, £200 per month. So we simulated this as well. We simulated with and what happened with and without mitigation measures. Okay, of course, we know that inflation will increase poverty, but with mitigation, sometimes the rate will be less. And as we can see from the right panel, that the extreme poor has decreased, which is very, very important here. So the actually what the mitigation measure here target the poorest of the poor, because they target the low pensioners, and also the government employees with a certain wage every month, and also the target expand the takaful and karam. So actually here the extreme poverty has decreased, but the other poor and the near poor do not. So actually the amount that was transferred to the poor, or that is intended to mitigate the impact of inflation, it's not enough to lift all the people out of poverty, but it lifted some of the people from being extreme poor to the poor, but it's not enough to lift them out of poverty. This is the numbers. I'm not going to. In terms of food security, also, as I mentioned, we projected also the change in we projected changes in consumption pattern due to inflation. And here is the caloric deficiency. It was in 2019. It estimated to be 18.5. With the inflation, with the current inflation, it was about 25%. And as I mentioned, it is always the caloric deficiency is always higher among all the population segments, but again maybe with different okay. We also try to not just we try to also not just to measure not just caloric deficiency, but also some micronutrient deficiency like vitamin A, folic acid, and so on. All of them, of course, all of the inflation effects increase all these kind or all these rates, but with different things. One of the very, very important thing is that even if we have caloric sufficiency, okay, but again, food security also is very important. If we have to look at the diversity of the food diet. It's not just to have consumption. We can eat all starches and so on, so we get our requirements of calories. But again, we have to look whether the household diversify their diet or not. So we estimated what is called acceptable dietary diversity, and it is also because of inflation, it has increased from 30.7 to 31.4. Well, I know the policy recognition is out of this scope, but I'd like because Shahir and they talked about macro policies and so on. I'm just want to mention some of two or three dimensions of social protection, which is, I think, it's very important. Actually, education. Education here is very important to break the vicious circle of poverty, and also try to increase the digital gap, which is, again, it is a very serious point in Egypt nowadays. The other thing, which is actually also maybe I didn't mention it here, but I want to mention in our meeting here, is that the poor spend more of their budget share on private tutoring, while the non-poor spend more of their budget share on school fees or something like this. So what I'm saying is that because of the bad quality or the not good quality, not good quality of the education system, the poor spend some of their budget, whether it's a great deal of their budget for private tutoring, while they can save this to get some more nutrient foods or shelter or whatever, nutrient food or shelter or something like this. So here actually, this is an essential, especially for the poor, to improve the quality of education provided to the poor segments of the population, so they can save their expenditure on education. The other one is health, because actually one of the analysis that I did is the expenditure on health. There is some I think it's WHO mentioned that 10%, if the household has 10%, spend 10% of their budget on health, it is risk. Of course, for the poverty, for the households, the households in rich households or non-poor spend more. But again, 28% of the poor spend more than 10% of their budget on health. 28%, which is again, it is very, very shocking amount. And this is why I called for reducing the out-of-pocket expenditure on health, at least for the poor. At least for the poor, the NGOs, government, or whoever can help the poor to get their health care without paying it. The final thing, or the final recommendations, it's not a very, but actually it is the takaful and karama. Takaful and karama, I think May mentioned, and also we did lots of analysis for this. It is good. It is a good targeted. I mean, they target the poor, but the coverage is very low. But again, I will here recommend, of course, apart from expanding the coverage and so on, again, increase the amount that or the transfers to the needy or to the takaful and karama beneficiaries, at least to the poverty line. To get them out of poverty line. This is one thing. The other thing, or if you can do this, we have to increase the amount transfers, and this is actually also for the pensioners, to increase it by inflation. It is to increase by the annual inflation. We should increase the amount transferred to the poor households by inflation. Of course, this is something, food subsidy is universal, but we have to target them to poor and poor and near poor, and then provide more benefits to them. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we are a few minutes probably late, but I think the discussion is really interesting. So thanks again, Dr. Eba. I think some of the key points that I captured is that first, looking at if we can call it a crisis between 2015 and 18, with the high inflation, with the devaluation of the pounds, poverty, the 5 percentage points from about 27 to 32 was basically driven again by inflation. So of course, looking at the past, we can really learn and assume, and in your estimation also, this is to some extent proven, that inflation will drive poverty and drastically. I had the opportunity to already have a look at this initial analysis, and I already told this morning, Dr. Eba, that I was impressed by, I didn't expect those numbers. I mean, this is again, you gave us a glimpse, and I think maybe in the next month or 2 months, we can, once this report is completed, we can organize a more in-depth session, to discuss and to see the numbers, and also for the government to see what's really happening and to understand the extent of the problem, because everybody knows that there is a problem, but they don't, many don't really understand the extent, the magnitude of the issue. You raised also, I mean, there are also some interesting and, let's say, positive points about that the mitigating measures that have been announced by the government are having a positive impact on the extreme poor. I think this is good. Obviously not a bit less on the near poor and the poor, but at least I think this is a good signal that at least the poorest of the poor in these countries are a bit more able to cope with what's happening. Still, you said it is not enough. And when we talk about takaful and karama, we talk about pensions. It's important to review the amounts, review the generosity of these programs to reach at least the poverty level. I see a bit of a connections also with what Shahid was mentioning. I mean, Shahid, again, I really liked this investment in human development, human capital infrastructure, I think you mentioned. And I think is one of your points, it's investing in education to break the intergenerational poverty cycle. And also you highlighted some very practical issues, how the poor families spend a lot of money on private tutoring to compensate with a less good quality that maybe richer families have access to in relation to education, and also the catastrophic health expenditures and that poor family face. I think it's very, very interesting, and I think they're really in line with the macro policy recommendation in terms of investing in human capital that Shahir was making, and also your points about investing in good quality education, because it will help families not to spend this money on education, but on in other areas. So let's maybe we can open for some comments from the audience. If it's okay, I would like to give priority to the people here in presence.
Absolutely. We have also, I mentioned it to our online, we have one comment from the online, but yes.
So let's see. Yeah, let's start the conversation here. I think the conversation, I mean, the question, the comments are, I would suggest to really focus about policy recommendation, policy measures. I mean, we had the panelists already shared their ideas from different levels, but I see that they are all interconnected. And also on the first presentation of Professor Meigedala. So if someone from the floor here has any points, any remarks, so we have one here. Anybody? I will take a couple, and then if you can say if any question or comments to any specific person, or if it's just a generic comment. Please, Dr. Osman.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to thank ERF and UNICEF for inviting me to this event, and I would like to congratulate Dr. Mai and Dr. Nesma for an excellent work. Well, actually, my comments will be related to my impression when I saw the presentation, and when I think that the next step is to send it to the policymaker, and then how they're going to perceive it. I think my suggestion is to try to avoid confirming conventional wisdom, because probably a policymaker will say, I know that. I don't care whether it is 29.7 or 29.6. I know that there is inflation, and there is no point to waste the effort and time on that, but to move to the policy recommendations. Having said so, I think we need to understand the mindset of policymakers, because usually if we put too many recommendations and they are not classified in a way that is convenient to their mindset, I think they will be confused and they will not do good. My suggestion is to think about policy recommendations that are short-term and long-term, instead of the current categorization of build a more resilient agri-food system in Egypt and then support the most vulnerable groups. I think it's better to have it short-term and long-term. And when we say, for example, reduce the country dependence on strategic food imports by increasing agriculture wheat production, I have heard that since I was a kid, but I mean, it is not feasible. I mean, nobody can do it, and nobody know how to do it. And it is conflicting with other agriculture policy, etc. It is too complicated to put it as the first policy recommendation, because it will sort of say we have heard that before and nothing can be done about it. The same for number 3, promoting the reduction of high bread consumption and bread waste, etc. And the Egyptians are consuming twice as much wheat as the world average. This is known, and this is the pattern. It is, nobody can do anything in the short term. I think it's better to suggest few things related to the short term. And having said so, I imagine that at that point of time, policymakers are hearing from academicians that we need to expand the cash transfer given the inflation, and we have to expand it horizontally and vertically in the same time. And we know that the physical space will not allow for that. Whether it is it's better to increase the amount of money, as Dr. Heba Lisi just mentioned, the amount of money that is distributed to the people who are already subscribing in the program, or to expand that to other households, and giving the same amount of money that is not enough for them. If we can say what to do and how, I think we will help the policymaker. But I think we need to, the author need to reformulate the policy recommendation in a way that is what to do, and then how, and then short term and long term. I think this will make it more attractive, given the amount of effort and knowledge that is there. My last recommendation is when we mention, for example, we need more data. I think this is very clear case, because we don't have data since the crisis. It's very difficult to do anything that is really serious without recent data. But the mentioning data was sort of focusing on stunting. I think we need more than that, we need basic information related to the current situation that is not there. My last recommendation is to put at the very beginning sort of basic data. For example, the number of households that have children, for example, is how many million households. And anything that we will do here, it will impact 6 million households, or 2 million households, or 10 million households. These figures, the policymakers are not aware of it, and I think it will make the storyline more interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very concrete, suggestion that I think can be, and I think it's really important to focus on policy recommendation and short and long term, very concrete on what and how. So be very, this idea about, suggesting how many families can be probably impacted by these policy recommendation. I think it will be good for the government. Yes, there was you, and then someone else. I think I've seen another hand. 2, and then 3, and then Shireen as well. Yes. If you can introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
Hi, I am Mai from the Institute of National Planning. I have 2 precise policy comments on policy recommendations. The first one, it's already mentioned. It's about the data gaps. Something that is mentioned in the presentations of Dr. Mai and Dr. Nisma is about government response. Government response, how a large part of government response, how we can get it without the lost data or the recent data that we have available for Takaful and Karama, and a lot of data, and even for the Decent Life Initiative, Mubarat Haya Karima, is 2019-2020. It's before the COVID-19, and it's before these crises. So we are making how to measure such impact, and we didn't have that. So this stress the point that, or the quote that said that, what cannot be defined cannot be measured, and what cannot be measured cannot be developed. We cannot work on development of such things or measuring its impact without having such important data. So the first policy recommendation, I think, it's that the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Social Solidarity, is to work to making these data available in order to have an informative decision making. The second point that I want to talk about is that something that is noted in a lot of policies that are done in Egypt is that we focus on the short run. We forget to look about the long run. And this is called effects that fail. We are looking that to make things better, even in the short run, but these in sometimes not only keep the things as it is in the long run. No, we are, as Dr. Shahir said, we are deviating from even the best scenario in the long run. And also, some policies, when we take it, for example, we want to make some people less poor, for example. this is done through Takaful and Karama and giving them cash transfers. Is that makes them less poor in the long run or only in the short run? And then if these transfers stopped, they come back to the poverty trap. So the point is that how to work on getting them out of the poverty trap, increasing their productivity, make them education better, make their health better. All of these things, part of these things are reflected in a decent life initiative that is done in Egypt in this period. But how to have all these comprehensive view of getting people out of the poverty trap and in the long run, not only in the short run. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a good point on the data. I mean, maybe there are ways, and other countries do have ways to collect data when a crisis happens, as sample surveys, smaller surveys. Also, I think that's a very good point. And your point, Takaful Karama alone cannot solve all the poverty issues in the countries. And you mentioned, I was writing down the Haya Karima, the education reform that needs to be that needs to complement this intervention. I mean, that's pretty clear. Thank you very much again. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Heba, and all attendees. I'm Nahid Yusri. I'm a head of social empowerment sector in Sawiris Foundation. Actually, I have two questions to Dr. Heba. Question and the first one is from social policy perspective, and also as a response to the current crisis. Do you think that increase and expand in Takaful Karama household and getting more engaged, enrolled in the program, this is the best solution for the critical time we are? Thank you. This is the first one. The second comment, I was exposed to some social protection in India, for example, like public work program. I'm wondering why we don't have such these programs that link between Haya Karima and the national programs as a sort of creating jobs for the community they are targeting, and just achieve the eligibility and the being as a space for them to find sort of jobs that it could be fit for them and for their skills. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe because it's a very specific question, I think the first question you can probably answer. The second question, I'm not sure it's really for Professor Heba. It would be more for the government for tomorrow.
It's not a question, it's a suggestion.
Just want to mention two things actually. One is that cash transfers is not solution for fighting poverty or reducing poverty. It is just an temporary things to till people cope with the other policies that is available. Education, health, whatever, job creation or whatever, but it is not a long-term or short-term solution. And that's why the design for Takaful and Karama, it was supposed to be 3 years, and after 3 years they are going to be re-evaluated or recertified, and to see whether they are improved or not. And the Ministry of Social Solidarity now, it has a program called Fursa for people who are now not enrolled in, or maybe they are still enrolled in Takaful and Karama, or maybe they are graduated from this Takaful and Karama. They can join the program Fursa, which provides either microcredit or wage works or something like this. So it is actually something complement each other, but they don't. But I wonder why this is questioned to me also, why in Haya Karima they don't introduce the public work criteria or whatever, because actually in the social fund, the social fund, the social fund, there was an emergency I think it was 2015, 2014, there was an emergency employment generating fund, and they provide this kind of public work. And I evaluated this, and it was very good because they actually, instead of, if anybody who is able to work, he can, instead of who is poor, instead of giving him just transfers, they allow him to, or her to work with very without jobs without any experience or whatever like this. And this actually make people gain some skills, you know, and of course no skills. And I can remember they مثلا start to learn how to مش عارفه اسمها ايه تركب سيراميك يعني مش عارفه I don't know how to يعني المهم some low skill jobs they gained this. Of course they were with no, they were actually with no skills at all, but they start to gain some skills because they were engaged in this public works. I don't know whether the government consider this kind of public work in حياة كريمة or not, but this is good. This is very good if they do. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it was this Ms. Meda program led by Ms. Meda, right?
Yeah.
And he ended a couple of years ago. So we have a question here, and then Professor Shirin.
So I don't know if it's working. It's not really a question, it's just a quick comment and contribution, hopefully, to the debate and the policy debate. So first, let me thank you, all the presenters and speakers, for their insightful and very informative, actually, presentations and talks. I fully agree with Alison when she mentioned that it's primarily a nutrition crisis, and also with Dr. Hiba when she talked about the effect of the crisis on malnutrition and the dietary patterns actually of Egyptian households and those households who have children, and how they are impacted. And of course, the cash transfers and Takaful al-Karama, as it was repeatedly said, it's one of the ways actually to reduce this effect. But also, I think the in-kind transfers through meals that are provided in public schools are also one of the things to focus on. And I remember there is this methodology called commitment to equity. It's a methodology that was applied in most Latin American countries, and the World Bank has replicated this work on Egypt. That was a number of years ago, before this crisis. But basically what this methodology is about is that it looks at the effect of the different fiscal tools on inequality and poverty. So we look separately at the effect of cash transfers, in-kind transfers, on education, on health, and so on. And as far as I remember, one of the things that were really important is all those meals actually provided in schools. The other aspect that I would like to bring actually to the picture are the demographic pressures. So Dr. Shahir, in his talk, he referred a couple of times to the importance of creating jobs and so on. But with numbers recently show actually an increase in the fertility rates, but also a decrease in the use of contraceptive methods, according to the latest data. And also there is the echo generation that is expected to put even more pressure on the labor market. And this generation is expected to actually ask for jobs. And of course, Dr. Hiba's talk about skills and education, I fully agree with it, because it's not any jobs, but really jobs with specific skills and education. And with the recent COP and the conversations, a lot of conversations that happened about which jobs actually do we need to create, and the green jobs and so on. So I think all those aspects maybe are very important here. The last point, and I'm sorry to, so it's about cash transfers, and there is this literature looking at who to give the money to. And I know the lack of data in the case of Egypt may be problematic to measure this, but I think giving, especially when we're focusing here on children, so giving money or transfers to mothers is very different than giving it to fathers, you know, and the consumption is different in the two different cases. So maybe this is something that's, I don't know, again, back to the lack of data every time we talk about something, but if there is a way of looking at this from a policy perspective, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for highlighting. I think I probably missed from Alison's point about school meals as a quick way to reach and to address. This is going to be primarily a nutrition crisis for families, you know, in terms of accessing food, as a channel, a way to really reach the right families and quickly as well, with an intervention that can have immediate impacts as well. So it's I think something to consider also for policy recommendations. So I have Professor Shireen, then we have the comment from online, and then two more, and I think we can. It's up to you. You are the timekeeper. So Professor Shireen, online comments, and then two more comments. Three more comments.
Well, I think we need to be to give the right guide to the two authors, and I am confused whether the paper should focus on a specific policy question, as I suggested, or we're broadening the scope to cover macroeconomic aspects, food security, nutrition, poverty. So this is, I think, this is a very difficult mandate for one single policy paper. So I think we have to tell them exactly what we expect from one single policy paper. This is the first. The second is about the way we're presenting policy recommendations. We as economists, the president said after the economic conference that all what was said is known by a student in the first grade in our faculty. So this will be applicable to all very broad recommendations. And what we're discussing today will be, I think, responded to in the same manner. So I think we need to look at any policy recommendation, whether there is a fiscal space, as Dr. Magid said. Like, I mean, we all believe that the school meals are important. But how many years have we, I mean, we have been discussing this issue, but no allocation, decent allocation is made for this purpose. This means that either, I mean, you make the recommendation and then you find a fiscal space and you say that an associated policy reform measure would be this, and this will not have any negative implications on cost of living or poverty or whatever. But without this, actually, it will be said, this is what the president said. We all know this. And the question is why this did not happen before. He did not tell us why. And I don't know why. And I think more important now than discussing the just the economic implications of is to say what would be. It's about the political economy. Why things happen or do not happen. This is the question. So the political desirability of any of the actions we're saying, and I like the way Shahir said the human capital infrastructure, and this resonates with what you said about labeling. It's the same, right? Human capital, we need to care more about human capital, but to make it attractive, I mean, more attractive to the policymakers now, we say infrastructure, since they are fond of infrastructure. But, and this is a good way, maybe it helps. I don't know whether it helps or not, but it will. So this is something. The data, as you said, and I've been reading things, and in the States, they have like monthly surveys on households and firms. So you have updated information about what is going on. Shahir, I would like you to be more like cautious while saying stabilization. Stabilization is necessary, but not sufficient. So we have been always adopting the necessary condition without proceeding with the sufficient ones. But even now, we have to stabilize before we conduct or associated with the structural reforms. Expanding Takaful and Karam. As I said, already in November, they reached 4.4 million households. So the remaining is less than 200 actually thousand households to achieve it during December. This is the plan. And amazingly, they said that now they absorbed all the applicants who are qualified. In the pipeline, they don't have a waiting list. So the problem now, what we should do next? Are we willing to expand the budget first? More than this, because it's still very tiny. It's less, it's in the range of 0.3% of GDP, very tiny. So are we willing to expand it? And then if we have resources, how to spend this? Who will be eligible for this? Should we do as Bolsa Familia did after 10 years of Bolsa Familia? They went to the villages where they know there might be some poor, they knocked at the doors. This is very costly, but this means that, but they are expecting to have applicants, more applicants due to this crisis. Did they open the door or not? I'm not sure, but this we have to wait and see whether there will be applicants. Otherwise, again, there will be doubts about the number of poor in Egypt if only 5.2 are benefiting from cash transfers, whether from the government or from the NGOs altogether. This will be like the maximum number. This is, I mean, the ceiling. I don't know how to say this. The food subsidies is universally distributed. It's Mahena baqى the question, and we have to debate this in a different session, and I would like the ERF to take the lead. According to the hikes, we have like 80% of the population benefiting from bread and 70% from food subsidy. Actually, in the fiscal statement of the government, it's 60 million individuals who are benefiting from ration cards. So there is a difference. There is a large difference, and we have to look at this. And I said to Dr. Heba, this is maybe the sample exclude the very poor and the very rich. So we're dividing the number of beneficiaries to a smaller population, but Dr. Heba does not think so, and she believes in hikes, but we need to, figure out why there is a large discrepancy between the official data from Ministry of Supply and hikes. But at the end, again, this is a semi-cash transfer. People get it, they go and buy whatever they like, but they like to buy unhealthy food, what you call, or the nutritionists call unhealthy food. Again, something to educate on how to improve the nutrition. This is a sample. And then social safety net, which is cash transfer, is just one part of social safety net, and social safety net is a small part of the social protection. And with the very strong social protection scheme, without growth, we cannot have a successful outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shirin. I think very good points. I think what we need to consider when we talk about policy recommendation, you mentioned the political economy and political desirability. I think it's important to factor in what the paper will suggest. So online comment, 3 more questions here, and then we wrap up. Yes, because we are a bit later.
Yes. We have 3 interventions online. One of a research-oriented nature from Mohammed Haroun al-Sadi. He's from Germany. He's asking about if there's no data about the impact of Ukraine. How are we ensured that the current situation is affected by the Ukraine war? Maybe there are other factors, because if we discuss in general, it is fine, but if econometrics perspective, it is in question. There's more of a policy-oriented question that's along the lines of what Dr. Magid had brought to the conversation from Mohammed Amin Abed El Sayed from Egypt. He asked about what are your recommendations to protect them? How do we implement those recommendations? And how can you finance the recommendations as well? So the finance aspect is coming in. From Amal Mansouri in Morocco, there's a question about, or a clarification about the impact of food security in terms of the number of people deprived from food due to inflation, and what about the children in particular? And as I spoke, there was another one from Ali Rashid. Thank you for the presenters. I have one comment regarding the food security, why the government cut down the subsidy for farmers while US no. Egypt lost in terms its main sector, agriculture, and face a worst case in making it available US dollars for importing and no internal production. I think Egypt should make use of the young people in the era of digital economy and entrepreneurship as well. And we have 2 hands raised. So you may want to give the floor, one of which is actually to Iman Khalil, who's the senior economist and our panelist tomorrow, and from Professor Dr. Sarhan, also agriculture professor. So let me know when you want to give the floor.
How do we tackle these points? Because I think some I can try these questions.
Would you like to get the responses when we bring in all the questions? Up to you.
Sure, because I think there are a couple of points about the first question, if there are data. Right now, I think there is an hike survey that has just been completed, and we're going to have the results next year. They may capture some of these shocks, but it's primarily on estimation that we are working on in terms of impact of the crisis. What else? I mean, a good point. I think we raised the recommendation, how to implement and how to fund this. I mean, no answer really there, but it's something that we need to consider for the policy paper. And then the other point was about cutting down subsidies for farmers, which I'm not sure is really happening. As far as I know, the government has increased subsidies, especially for wheat production, to try and increase domestic production. But let's see the 3 questions here, and then we go back to the 2, and then we try to wrap up. There was one hand here, no? Okay, so maybe Alison.
Sure, just briefly, something else that I'd wanted to share initially, and I think it gets at some of the question of like, how do we concretize recommendations that are actually based on evidence? So something I wanted to share is based on work that we're doing right now with the Sawiris Foundation. And so this also gets at the policy recommendation in the paper of thinking through how do we strengthen linkages from social welfare to labor. And of course, like it's a great idea, but like, how do you do it in practice? So something that we're working together on now and evaluating in Sohag and Asyut is a program that takes a Forza-like model, but actually builds on like plus additional interventions. So we call this Bab Amal. It's built on a global evidence-backed program initially designed by BRAC in Bangladesh that at its core transfers an asset, but it also includes cash transfers. So in this case, it's households that are recipients of Takaful and Karama, together with life skills training, together with how to convert that asset, whether it's livestock or supplies for trade, into like a revenue generating business. So a handful of these wraparound services. It is obviously intensive to implement. So Sawiris is working on implementation here with a couple of NGOs in the governorates. But in the global evidence where this was tested in Bangladesh and again in several other countries, what we've found is the results on economic and non-economic outcomes over time significantly outweigh the costs of the program. So turning to like, how do you make the case to policymakers? This is an expensive program. It's a program that would require a lot of fiscal space, but in the longer term might actually reduce the demands on the public budget because it is actually a path to, I think the colleague who mentioned this has left, but to breaking poverty traps and to getting households on more of a sustainable path to like self-employment. So we'll soon be in a position to share some of the results of what we're learning in Egypt, but the initial impacts look positive. So this is something that I think we're excited to try to bring into the policy dialogue, but that will require a lot of, all of the minds here, I think, to think through how do we implement this? How do we find the fiscal space for something like that? So that's one that I wanted just to note that there are like concrete ideas that we can be thinking about. And then a second, I think it's great that we've also talked about Haya Karima, which of course is focused very much on physical infrastructure, but does have a human capital infrastructure perspective as well. And from the JPAL perspective, something that we would love to be able to do with, maybe some of the government partners who we'll hear from tomorrow is, Haya Karima as a really big umbrella will consist of so many different programs and has really ambitious goals. The question is, what is the right mix of programming to actually accomplish those goals? And that's where impact evaluation can be a really helpful tool for government to say, okay, let's evaluate 3 or 4 different ways to try to improve labor market outcomes or educational outcomes, and then invest the budget in the ones that prove to be the most effective and the most cost effective. So we would like to, I guess, request maybe incorporating into the recommendations the idea that bringing evaluation into some of these longer term priorities that help to build resilience in the face of future crises is something that it would be great to consider as well.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you all actually for very informative presentations, and it brought a lot of good discussion. Just like want to add like another point to the or a suggestion to the project overall, or maybe you can include it maybe in the first paper. But going back to the point that Russia made about how to get the poor out of the poverty. It's not just like about cash transfers and so on. It's like, so what's next? I think to answer this question, we need to from the start to bring in the picture of what is the structure of the household inside before and after the crisis, particularly regarding the labor market, the labor force participation. If there is how the wages changed. In terms of what the the labor, how the household structure in terms of contributing participating in the labor force, what they're an added worker effect, a discouraged worker effect among the youth, among the children, among the women, how they really cope with the crisis, to be able to get some policy recommendation regarding the household themselves. Also their education structure, or they more dropouts, something happened to the enrollment rates, how they were affected with, especially that there was a sort of a combination of many things at the same time. But we need this picture to come in to be able to really give more well-targeted policy recommendations toward the households, since we're talking about the vulnerability of the household and children within the households. We were missing this in the picture. That's what I see when I'm sitting here. And I know, as Dr. Shireen mentioned, we're bringing many things together, and it's hard to say which should go in which paper. So maybe either it will be a new paper, part of it will be added. Then that's a suggestion to the first paper. But I think this is really important to be able to put more focused policy recommendations. And another point, or actually, I like very much when Dr. Heba suggested the education and more of a substitute to private tutoring, which is really a problematic for a long term in Egypt, for a long time in Egypt. But if we can think about, there is a lot of lessons learned from JPAL. Actually, they had a lot of projects about alternative education structure for the poor, targeted for the poor. Some of them are really very cheap. And Alison, of course, can talk more about it. Even just bringing the less qualified, less how we can say it, the less the bad students, if you can say, the low grade students alone in separate classes. Okay, so this really helps a lot, and it's very cheap. Okay, or actually just having them extra tutoring or within the class, just taking them for 2 hours
with a special teacher or a special promoters. Things like that are very easy to do, and I think very cheap, and Alison can add on it a lot. And it would really save the money, save a lot of money, or a lot of the budget that is going to private tutoring as a start at least. So maybe you can think about that and bring in more of the lesson learned from Japan on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you tackled on quite a few issues, like structural issues on why people are poor here in Egypt and globally. So, and also your point of deciding what's going to be in this paper, what is not going to be in the paper, because we want to be focused as well. So we have a final point here from the floor, and then two more online. One more online. Yes. If you can introduce yourself as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Shayma Mahboub, Senior Economic Researcher at Ministry of Planning, and now I moved to a project related to labor market in Egypt, USAID project, and cohesion project between USAID and EFI. From my point of view, one of the most significant intervention to get most of people out of poverty trap is to increase employability. That's well known. And it takes some time, and it's a long-term recommendation. But we can highlight two main pillars. One is to increase or to promote education and skills on the one hand, and on the other side is to make the economy more able to generate more sufficient jobs for the new entrance to the labor market year by year, because of we know the unemployment rate in Egypt is highly between the educated youth, and this is a big problem that significantly affect the poor issues in other in many dimensions. So increase this employability requires as a prerequisite factor to work on the training, especially the transformative training. We have here in Egypt lots of the graduated from the education system, and they are low skilled labor, and you have to and they are unemployed. If these segments of the society enhanced to engage in the labor market, this will give them or help them in yielding sustainable income, and sure it will be an important factor to get them out of poverty, especially when taking into consideration the gender aspect in this area. The female educated female are highly unemployed in their share than the female. So employability have to be increased by in the long run promote education, and on the short run to promote training for these segments of youth. The huge, we have about more than 60% of our society youth, young people. So it have to be this huge percent increase the poverty share in our society. So if these segments of the society engage in the labor market and they can gain income, they will get out of poverty in a sustainable way and in a more applicable way. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's it's really about labor and jobs at the end of the day for sustainable poverty reduction. I think this can be because we are highlighting some bit longer term reforms, and I think this kind of crisis do allow this kind of starting proper reform, including the labor market. So thanks for this final point, and then
if we can give the floor to Dr. Iman Helmi for 1 or 2 minutes, please, so that we can wrap up in 10 minutes, if that's okay. Hopefully. Yes. Okay, Iman.
Yes, thank you so much, ERF and UNICEF teams, for your kind invitation. And I'm really looking forward to be with all of you in person tomorrow. Just a quick question from my side. I think Dr. Heba Lisi is in a better position maybe to answer this question. My question is related to urban poverty, because we have recently collaborated with Basira team led by Dr. Maged Osman on getting real-time data about the initial impacts of the crisis. And we started to see some trends related to severity of the crisis among people living and households living in urban areas. And I was wondering whether Dr. Heba, also from her research, she was able to see maybe complementary or similar results regarding urban poverty, and whether we should be able to provide some policy recommendations around urban poverty if it will be a phenomenon that Egypt will be witnessing in the short term. Especially that we all know that the chronic poor are more in rural areas and CPI is higher in rural areas, but we still get some trends related to urban poverty. The second comment very quickly is related to what Dr. Rana Rohindi raised about the CEQ and the fiscal incidence tool developed by the World Bank. And thank you so much for raising this point. I just would like to highlight that we have updated the tool with the hikes of 2017 in collaboration with Ministry of Finance. And this tool is able also to answer some questions related to the marginal contribution of each policy measure, like food subsidies or ration cards or cash transfer, etc., to the poverty headcount and Gini index. And this could be one of the tools to provide answers to the questions that we have raised today regarding whether to increase the benefit or increase the coverage, which policy measure could be leading to better results in terms of poverty. And some of these results already are published through the public expenditure review. I can share it with you. And we are also working with the Ministry of Finance to update the results of 2022 and look at the impact of the crisis. So I stop here and thank you so much for the insightful discussion today.
Thank you, Mani. I think there's one question specific for Dr. Heba about urban poverty.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, I think, Imani, you okay? I'll try to summarize the question. So what Imani was saying is that they've been doing some work with Professor Maged Osman on on data on the impact of the crisis in urban areas. If, from your opinion and also some of your recent analysis, you have identified any trends on the impact of this crisis, especially on urban families?
Well, urban areas has a special case, of course. I mean, if employment rate has a problem in urban areas, social protection is less than urban areas. I can't get the question actually, but there is some specific characteristics for urban areas versus rural areas. Yes, of course there is. Yeah. What I want to mention, as you mentioned before, because hikes now they have 2021-22 hikes is almost it's finished now. They are just cleaning the data, and I think it covers all the Egypt areas. And in a good representative, because sometimes the specific the special surveys it's not very much representative at the country level, but this is, I think it's a good idea, and maybe there is actually lots of literature for lots of literature handle urban poverty versus rural poverty. They are quite different things, because actually the causes for urban poverty is different than rural. But again, if we have good coverage of the hikes or whatever data, survey data, it's okay. I want to ask, because of the dialogue here, what is the purpose of this our dialogue? Is it the policy recommendations for or to mitigate the impact of Ukraine and inflation crisis, or it is to fight poverty as a whole or something? Because I heard here, well, to reduce poverty, or it's something much more bigger than what we are talking about right now. So we have to be actually focused on what is the purpose of this dialogue. Thank you.
A very good point. I mean, I think the focus of this paper, of this discussion, and tomorrow's discussion about is really about the mitigating impact of the crisis.
Yeah.
Now, I think that by increasing resilience, and this is some aspects that are being highlighted in terms of investment in education, employability, we increase the resilience of families for future shocks as well. And these are more longer term strategy that I think maybe should not be central to the policy recommendation, but should be mentioned at least. But definitely, this is really focusing on now, on the crisis, on the shocks, and that's what Alexson said. This is a nutrition crisis first. I think we can. We have yes. A really final concluding remark.
First of all, I would like to thank everyone who attended today, and whether in person or online, and for this fruitful discussion, and for the recommendations and the comments that will make sure to incorporate these comments in the revisit of the paper. And I'm a little bit biased to my professors, so I would like to thank them all, and the other audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're ready to wrap up. I mean, from my side, I want to thank you all very much. A very interesting discussion. As usual, time is never enough, but hopefully we can continue in different ways. And again, thanks to the ERF colleagues. So over to you for your final closing.
I want to give the floor to Yasmin for 1 minute and close on an invitation for us. Okay.
Thank you all very much. I always feel like when we start on time, but we stay for longer, that means we had a very engaging event. So thank you all for your input. We were just trying to set the scene at the beginning, but this was no way like a final product. And with all this input, we'll be able to hopefully present you towards the end of the month with a revised, polished version that is more sharp and that develops further the policy recommendations, because this is a policy paper that hopes to shed the light on what can we do to mitigate the impacts of the crisis. So this would be the, when we may be able to have another round of feedback, even through email, with our distinguished speakers. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for fantastic input, very rich discussion. And we do have a session for tomorrow, where we're hoping that we'd be joined by members from the civil society and government and policy makers, but we'll be circulating also an invitation for you to join us online should you wish, and we continue the conversation. Very grateful, and perhaps we can continue a little bit more chatting on the networking in person over coffee outside. Thank you very much, and to tomorrow.